Everybody, and a warm welcome. The Directorate of Art and Culture, in collaboration with Foundation for Indian Art and Education, GOVA, organizes Art Talks, a lecture series on visual art by prominent Indian personalities in the field of art. And this is the third lecture of the series, wherein we have with us Shri Sudhir Patwardhan, famous Indian contemporary artist. We welcome you, sir. Born in Maharashtra in 1949, Shri Sudhir Patwardhan is a self-taught artist and a practicing radiologist. Apart from several solo shows, he has participated in international exhibitions like Aspects of Modern Indian Art, Oxford, UK, Contemporary Indian Art, Festival of India, London, 7 Indian Artists, Hamburg, West Germany, Contemporary Indian Art, Festival of India, New York, etc. Patwardhan's canvases are densely populated, reflecting the hub of the city life, often with emphasis on the ordinary working man. His human forms are imbued with a sense of innate dignity as they go about performing their course in busy city streets or in suburban construction sites. More recently, the receding and emerging figures provide a rhythmic unity to his group compositions, echoing the ancient mural art of Ajanta and Ellora. A warm welcome on behalf of department. I also welcome each and every art lover present here, and I request our Deputy Director Shri Ashok Parab to welcome Shri Patwardhan with flowers. And I request you again to present to Patwardhan a memento as a token of appreciation. Thank you, sir. We all are eager to. We all are eager for the talk. As we all know, the talk will be followed by question answer session with the artist. Please put your mobile phones on silent mode. I thank Shri Sudhir Patwardhan for sparing his time and accepting our invite. And I also thank all art lovers for your presence and participation. Thank you all. Over to you, sir. May I request you to start with the talk.
Thank you. To the Directorate of Art and to the Foundation for Indian Art Education, Sanjeev Chandani, for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure. I was asked that I should present a kind of retrospective slideshow of my work. So that is almost 40 years of work, so it will be a slightly long session. Please bear with me. I hope to kind of wrap it up in 50 minutes to an hour. The title that I've given the talk is Themes and Concerns. Themes, because there have been different themes in my work. Over the period, one takes up different subject matter and speaks through them. Concerns are more consistent, there are fewer, and they run through the themes. So we'll try to unravel as we go along. Just as an introduction, it was mentioned I was a practicing radiologist. I stopped my practice some years back, but I trained as a doctor, and while in medical college, I began to paint, much in the way in which young artists start, especially when I was in Pune, in all the smaller centers, starting with watercolor landscape and oil portrait. So this is just the beginning. But I moved to Bombay in the early 70s, and the effect of the city was immediate and lasting. So that since then I have been painting the city, and in the early phases the subjects mainly came from the working class population of the city. So it was images of this kind. It's called Truck. This is in around 76, 77. This one is called Dhakka, Mal Dhakka. So it was these people that I was sketching and painting. The reason was, of course, that they were the most common sights around me while traveling in the train or by walking around in the road or looking at the areas of central Bombay, but also this one is called construction site. The reason was also that I was ideologically inclined towards a left ideology, towards Marxism, and painting the workers was something of a ideological commitment for me at that time. So it was not just painting individual human beings, individual people, but it was painting kind of class. It was a class portrait that I was aiming at. Grain. All these works were oiled on canvas, medium size, 4 feet by 3 feet. Irani restaurant. You might know that Bombay was had many of these Irani restaurants, which slowly now have given way to other establishments, but it was a very important part of the cultural life of Bombay because it was not only artists and poets and people like that who sat here, but also frequented by very ordinary people. But there's also a shift, you might notice, that from painting single figures slightly distorted to express some kind of identification with the condition of the working class. There is a shift here towards greater observation of the situation, greater observation around the figure. Green truck. I'm sorry. Pressing the wrong button. City. And along with the greater observation, it also moved towards more complex structures in the sense of firstly including more people in the work. Earlier there was a single figure, so there was a one-to-one relationship with the subject, with either the artist and the subject, and when the viewer is looking at the canvas, again it's the viewer and one subject. But introducing more figures in the work introduces different kinds of force lines, different kinds of things happen. So as you see here, for example, you are looking at a person drinking a cup of tea, and there's someone else from the bus looking into at someone else. So there are various kinds of forces active. And the idea was to explore spaces. That each individual, when he lives in the city and moves about in the city, he moves around with a space around him, and which is in constant conflict and friction with other spaces. So at times it becomes claustrophobic, at times it becomes a combined force, at times it becomes a communication with someone. So those were the kinds of things that I was thinking of. This painting is called Accident on Mayday. It was an incident that I saw, not on Mayday, but I saw an accident which is common enough. Someone coming under the rail track in the suburban railway. But it's also slightly metaphorical because this was painted in 81, and it was a time when the working class movement had begun to show some kind of decline. So an accident on Mayday is something is being derailed. I'm sorry again. This is called street play. So as you see, the compositions became more involved, more complex, more figures, and the stories that they're telling also become a little more complex. In this one, again, there is a metaphorical element because you see a figure against the pink pillar, which is the figure of the artist who is looking at a group of people doing a street play, which obviously is some committed youth who are speaking on behalf of maybe the mill workers. Everyone, I think, has heard about the mill strike that took place. This was painted in 81, the strike was in 82. So it's again about ideology, it's again about commitment, it's also about questioning the idea of a middle class intellectual committing himself to an ideology of the working class, which raises many questions of motivation. So that's the kind of area that it's called ceremony. There's also a movement. We ourselves, I and my wife were staying in central Bombay, which was a working class area, and I was working in that area, and then we moved to a suburb. So moving to the suburb also changed things. I mean, the environment that I was living in changed somewhat, and there were different kinds of people that I was looking at and painting. Ceremony refers to here with the crow, something of maybe a Shraddha ceremony or something like that. In this work, again, there is an attempt to explore spaces in a different way, including interior spaces and exterior spaces. There's a bus load of people returning from or going to the night shift or returning from the night shift, a couple. And then you look into the house where activities like a child sleeping, someone may cooking happening. And then there's also this element on the first floor where there's someone singing and there's some people listening to a lady singing. So this in the city, and especially at night when you move about a city and you invariably are looking into people's houses and you're looking into chawls and you're looking into this complex life pattern, life that's continuously happening in the city. So there are all these multiple lives interacting in different ways, and so it is in some senses, and of course the single figure crossing the road is the early 70s and 80s and kind of good for nothing artist poet with his jholi. Then, as I said, because we moved to live in the suburbs, and an aspect that I was interested in earlier, landscape, re-entered the work, and I started to explore different problems that painting landscape and painting open spaces throws up. For example, the problem of foreground and background. And looking at the work of Cesar and looking at other painters, the way in which this is resolved, or people trying to resolve this in different ways. But being a painter, it's always that the stroke which represents a far off element, a rock or a hill, and the stroke that represents the stroke very next to it, which represents something that's very close. How do they relate to each other? So there were explorations of space, structure. So these are two paintings, the boy and the calf. And the calf painting has an abstract element of a kind of nawar, I don't know if that word is common, but the kind of bed that is made out of strips of cloth. So that pattern of a nawar which is woven and that creates a kind of space of coming forward, going back, coming forward, going back, which is replicated in the work of the calf. So this is a kind of homage painting to Cézanne and to the idea that I myself used to go out into these spaces and paint from sitting in front of the motif as such and doing landscapes. It's called Artist with Cycle. This is a painting from '84. Apart from Cézanne, the other influence and the other area that I was exploring is Indian miniatures. That how does space work in those? How does the background which goes up towards the horizon and the foreground which comes down to the bottom of the composition, how do they relate? And not just through one perspective, not just through a single perspective which constructs the whole space, the use of multiple perspectives within a space, and how do then these multiple perspectives interact with each other to create a complex space which can be entered at multiple points. So the point of entry of the viewer is not fixed, so he can choose various points of entry into a space built like this. So these are larger paintings, of course. Some of the earlier, larger in the sense 6 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. This is a detail of that work. You see the father and the young girl on the cycle going across the Maidan. There is a painting called Memory Double Page. I was attempting, as I said, to paint in one particular area near where I stay in Thana. I stay in Thana, we stay in Thana near Bombay. And one particular area in that, which is called Pokhran, but which is nothing to do with the Rajasthan Pokhran. But this Pokhran area, I used to go and actually sit down and paint there. I did a lot of over 3 years. And then I wanted to do one painting which would encompass the whole area. And when I was thinking of this painting, I was led back to a memory of my childhood when I was staying in Pune, in Khadki. And there was a kind of mapping that had taken place in my mind of the whole area of where I stayed. So that the house where I lived, the house where a friend lived, the playground there where we went to play football, and the roads that we used to cycle by, and various things like that were mapped in my mind. And I just discovered that there was this automatic mapping that takes place in our mind of places that we live in or visit. And by mapping, I mean actually, like I know that my house was in the right corner, while the playground was in the left upper corner, and things like that. So there's this mapping, and I did this painting to explore what this kind of mapping does, how it happens. I don't know how it happens, but just to explore that possibility of paintings. The equivalent may be something like Chinese landscape painting, for example, where in one view you have multiple places which are linked only by the artist having moved through them. So they are not, you cannot see all these spaces from any one point where you can stand, but because the artist around these different places, he's brought them together. So something like that is happening here. So this is Memory Double. This is a large painting, 10 feet by 7 feet. And this is the painting that came out of that experience of painting the earlier work. And this is a painting of Pokhran. So this is the kind of area where I've done multiple paintings of different parts of the area. And now I was doing one image. And you can see the multiple viewpoints, and the idea of the Chinese landscape painter walking in the landscape also comes in here, as you see someone walking up on your left, walking up the road, and the sunlight in that part of the painting is falling from behind him, but then as he goes up the hill and he looks back, then the sunlight is in the opposite direction. So these different perspectives, these different viewpoints are all bound together in an image of one area, but an image not painted from one point of view, or not from one spot as such. So this is again a largish 8-feet painting, Okran. This is another painting of that area. So that area was an area at the margin, in a sense, of the city. So earlier I had painted the city, the crowded streets, and more or less a kind of urban cityscape. But now I was painting the margin of the city, and which meant the area where the city is expanding, where it is moving, it is swallowing up nature in a sense. This painting is called Fall. Bombay, this is like in early 90s now we've come up to, and Bombay by then had expanded tremendously, and the city had grown in all directions, and it was, the industry had more or less moved out. Bombay, which was essentially an industrial city, from the 80s onwards, from the 80s it lost its textile industry, and then it started to lose the chemical industry and various other industries to housing, basically, because land prices were so high that housing was replacing a lot of industry, and that also meant a final kind of death of the working class as a class. So now what you had were only contract laborers and people who were lumpen, essentially. So in my mind, Fall had something to do with that sense, but it's also looking forward. It's also saying that things have changed, and now it's another world, it's another reality as such. The other major change in the early 90s was, of course, the change brought about by the destruction of the Babri Masjid and the ensuing riots that happened in Bombay and all over the country, and the kind of split that this has brought about in the social fabric. This was a painting I did a little later, around 95, but it was a painting that I started thinking about immediately after the riots, but it's always very difficult to paint something like riots. Your experience as an artist, I was not like, I was not part, I did not suffer directly, so your experience can never match the horror of the actual incidences that you have read about or seen on TV and things like that. So it's very difficult to come up with an image which will address this. But it also becomes very necessary for one to do something about it, or about it in the sense just to say something, say your mind. I think there is a detail of this mad woman on the street. So madness engulfing everyone, more or less. This is a painting called Shak, done about the same time. It was done before the painting on the right. And Shak is doubt, the kind of Shak ki nazar se dekhna. To everyone around you is seen with the eye of suspicion. And this was a change, palpable change in the life of everyday life of Bombay. This was a change that one felt when one traveled in a train. This was a change when one walked through certain communities or certain areas in a bus. So it was a change that you're always suspicious of people. So this is a painting called Shak. But being in a crowd has not, for me, been a negative experience at all, in a sense. Right from the time I went to Bombay, being in a crowd was always, in many ways, a positive experience, in the sense that I felt part of something. And the crowds always in Bombay had a common goal, like everyone is climbing up the railway bridge to cross over to the other platform, or then everyone wants to get into. There is, of course, competition, there is, of course, people pushing each other, and there is all that. But apart from that, there is also this sense of a common goal. There's also this sense that there's a kind of rhythm to this crowd. So I did paint crowds in that sense, in which it was not essentially a negative sense of being in the crowd. These are mid-90 paintings. Another painting from the same period, Station Road. The kind of dispersal of a certain rhythm of people going to work or coming back from work, which may happen if a madman suddenly pops up in the center of the street. So, and then the readjustment of that movement that happens. So, this is the point where I would like to kind of the Ajanta, that is another kind of source of influence. That while painting crowds, again, you paint, if you paint a crowd from as a participant as an eye level, then you see the front level of the crowd, and then you only see heads behind them. But if you move up, and this is what the Ajanta painters did, that they painted rows and rows of people all at eye level. And painting them at eye level means that you have the feeling that you are a participant and moving through that crowd in some senses. So this is the idea in which these works were structured, even the earlier work and this work, where there is this movement, there is this place, there is this row by row kind of unveiling of the crowd, one behind the other. Some other images of the 90s, people's lives, themes I had mentioned earlier. And so earlier there was these working class people, then there was the city itself, which was a theme, areas in the city, platforms, cafes, and things like that. Then there was the landscape, there was a suburban landscape, there was the margin of the city, which was another theme, and ordinary lives of people in the city. You know, the problems that they face, the monsoon flooding, man with TV. So, you know, they're both, it can be comic and tragic at the same time. What does a man want to save most when the floods kind of enter his house? So it could be something as precious to him as a television set. A gaddi maker, it's called Sleep. Someone sleeping with a Solapur chadar on the street. So most of these people who make mattresses actually make them on the street because they don't have space enough in their small shops. So it's at night that they bring out all this and sit and. Another influence that I'd like to mention is Mexican muralists, for example. I mean, in the crowd scenes, it is more obvious, but then also in the way in which this figure is painted, I think there is something Mexican muralists, Rivera and Orozco, people have greatly admired. And also not just the social life of people and people's ordinary everyday lives, but their private lives as well. And I do a lot of drawings. So drawings are always essential kind of, or parallel kind of activity happening along with the paintings. It's called Confession. It's called Couple Woman Reading. I'm sorry. Yeah. Many times paintings, you have a vague idea and then you have to work and work and work at it, and then slowly the idea kind of evolves into an image which becomes a painting. But at rare times you're given an image. It's like a gift. So in this sense, this was a painting that just I was standing. I went to the window of my studio, and just across in the other building was this man standing in his balcony and hiding his face from the sun, from behind this shadow of the pillar. So it was an image that was immediately given, and the moment I saw it, I knew that this was a painting. And then into 2000s, city again, of course. I mean, as I said, I've always painted the city. This painting is a large painting, horizontal, 14 feet in 4 panels. It's called Ulhasnagar. That's an area, one of the suburbs of Bombay, which has power looms. And it was an area that was growing. This was painted in 2001. Now, of course, it has changed much, but even this painting, I'll show you a couple of details. And before I move to the details, I'll say that the 4 panels represent a kind of movement from, it's a kind of panorama of urbanization as such. So starting with an area which is just becoming urban, to moving to a fully evolved, or even an area that is now started to degenerate as an urban city. So it's a kind of historical panorama, and it's the various panels are also painted as if at different times of the day. So these are like morning and afternoon panels, and it's, I mean, the kind of agricultural small kind of patch of vegetables and things like that is still there, but the industry is there. And then you move, and then this was the buildings behind are imaginary. They were not there in Ulhasnagar when I painted it, but I knew that this is the way in which the place is moving, that ultimately it's going to be all high rises and things like that. There's a polluted kind of stream, of course, and a place which seems to be decaying now. So from becoming an early city to moving slowly towards a decaying city. So that was the kind of panorama. Oh, thank you. That was the kind of panorama different from the Pokhran panorama, for example, or the memory double page, because those did not have that sense of a historical movement. Well, this does. This painting is called Lower Parel. It's another, I would say, history painting as such. This was again painted in 2001. The textile strike happened in 82, and most of the mills closed down. And then from the 90s onwards, the gentrification of that area began, and the builders, and there's lots of tussle between the mill owners, the mill workers, and the builders and everything, and then ultimately no kind of rewards for guessing, but the builders won out. And the mill areas are now completely kind of full of large high-rise buildings. This was the beginning of that period. And the old stone bridge built by the British and still stands. stands as a witness to what happened to the life of ordinary people who were mill workers, who lost their jobs, and then their children, and then what kind of life do they now lead. So this was kind of a story about that. But I would like to say one thing about, when one talks about paintings which have subject matter like this, or any other recognizable subject matter, and one often talks about this painting is this. For example, this painting I just mentioned, this is about this. But what does it mean? What does if a painting is about something? It is not as if the artist wants to speak about that issue. See, this is the experience of the artist. This is the starting point. What I live with, what I look around, what I think, because of what are my concerns. I may think in a certain way, I may feel in certain ways. And that is the experience of the artist. And that is with that experience, the artist makes paintings. And when you make paintings, when you make paintings, all the other elements that I spoke about, for example, how is space structured, how have different people, how have Chinese landscape painters structured their space, how is Ajanta structured, how are miniaturists structured, how did César do it, and all these issues of how to structure a painting are the core. So the painting, you can say, is about those things, or it is about this, but it becomes easier to talk about through subject matter. So sometimes it gets confusing that is the painting about that issue? Is it about the mills getting closed? Is it about that? It isn't about that. That is my experience. That is the experience of so many other people who share this. And then it is a painting. And it is a painting, and it is speaking as a painting through its structure. And then it's up to the audience and your own experience to see the way in, to see what it tells you, what it says to you. These are paintings from 2007 or so, and they're Bombay, as I see it again. One feels in Bombay that there is kind of a crisis, a kind of infrastructure crisis slowly growing with the growing population, with the kind of growth of unauthorized structures and hiders, everything. And the flooding of the river and all that has shown that Bombay is in fact not coping too well with its growth. And these paintings reflect some of that element of crisis, of something that's about to collapse, something that's not a happy place to live with in a sense. It's crowded, these are not titled, it's untitled, but they are large paintings, 8 feet by 6 feet. They're diptychs, in fact, these two. This one is another diptych, the same period. It's called Bylane Saga. It's structured like an altarpiece, in fact. So there are various things happening. There are 5 spaces, in fact, 3 on top and 2 below. The spaces below in which on one side people are going and on the other side people are coming. So this is a common view in any area where, for example, morning people go to work, after evening they come back from work. But then there are other things happening on top. For example, there is this old man and a woman with a child, kind of family scene. But there's something more kind of doubtful that's happening on the other side, where a person is collapsing and 3 people are either helping him or maybe they are the ones who have attacked him. So this element of underlying violence in the city was also something that I was trying to address or was feeling at this time. This is a detail of that. One side of that, and this is the other side. and more direct images of street violence and things like that. There was a period earlier when one thought that if an incident of violence occurs, it's an aberration. Normally, the city works smoothly, normally things are harmonious, normally things work well. But at times, things go wrong and there are incidences. Later, one began to think that maybe the harmonious periods are the exception, and maybe they are just a cover, that all the time there is some kind of violence happening in the city. It's called killing. So this sense of generally a city in crisis, and also a social fabric which is torn, and a growth of violent killings and things like that increasing. All this was part of what I was thinking about. Self, studio and family. So this was also a period when there was a kind of withdrawal from the city, in a sense, because at one level it was becoming, one needed to go back into one's own space, and so this is a painting called Studio Ghosts. It's a studio painting. There's a painting on one side and there's a window through which one sees something else outside. And there are other figures in the painting, which are, it's called Studio Ghosts because an artist paints in the studio, he's alone, but he's never really alone. There are all these presences that haunt him. This is a painting called Abstractionist. These paintings are from the same series of the studio. Again, a reality outside, and the artist working on something, and the whole question of abstraction, the whole question of what gets abstracted and what it takes for an artist to abstract something from reality. This is a painting called Difficulty in Telling the Truth. And it's at various levels. For example, self-portraiture. It's a self-portrait, and there's an art, he's sitting and looking at his own self-portrait also. So self-portraiture always raises the question of truth. And is the artist telling the truth about himself? But there is something beyond that. That what do you represent? For example, there are two windows. What you see outside both those windows is the same scene. What you see in front, in the window in the middle of the work, is actually supposed to be a painted window. So what the person with the back to you is looking at is a painting of an artist sitting and a window painted behind him. So this question of what is real and what is represented, or to pose it the opposite way, is the real ever other than a representation? What you see is always in a sense a representation. Your mind represents something to yourself. So do you really get to reality ever? And is that a problem? And to highlight that particular issue, there is, if you can see it, there's a small white blob of paint in the right corner, your right corner on the palette. And when you look at the painting, that is actually a blob of white paint. So, and it is also in the painting a representation of a blob of white paint. So how do these two things work? A representation of something and being something. So it is kind of questions of that nature that are playing on the artist's mind when doing this. Family, painting initiated by the birth of our first grandson. So, in a sense, a celebratory painting, but also in a sense, a realization that you, as the elder generation now, are off center. The next generation is now taking over. And all these thoughts about being a father, being a son, and being a grandfather, all these, in a sense, were what led to this work. Full circle. Just as that painting is, in a sense, celebratory about, this is also a painting, not also, but this is a painting about death and waiting for death, and all the people in the family who may wait for someone's death, and the guilt that this brings about, and various issues like that one thinks about and one needs to talk about in some sense. This is called family fiction. So here there is of course a family, and there are images from outside that have entered into the family space. There are images from cinema, from pulp fiction, and there are images from painting, Cesar's nude Vedas. So the family space is always also home to outside influences, outsides. So this negotiation is a constant thing that is happening. Father's story. Again, a family portrait of, it's called Transmigration. So, family which was based in a small town, Sangli in this particular, and moved to Pune, and then it's moved on where the son is abroad, and this kind of transmigration of generations and how they're kept together, how they're looking at old photographs. This is a painting from the studio series. It's called Eclectic. So, an artist looking at a landscape outside, which may be a miniature landscape, it may be a Renaissance landscape. It's again about influences and what all we bring into the studio, what all we bring into the family space. So, this outside world that is always coming in various forms. There's certain works which are allegories, which are not typical of the kind of work that I do, but which I have felt at times, which I've needed to and wanted to do. So, they are, in a sense, this one is called Moral Counsel. It's a painting about adolescent ideas about guilt and sex and hell, and the quotations. One of the things is in all these works is, in these particular works that I'm now showing, is the quotation. So that's an image on the top is from Roger van der Weyden's painting of I forget the title, but a painting of people being pulled down into hell. This is a painting called Witness. It's about an artist's image as a romantic idea of the artist, an artist as seer, as madman. You know, this is a kind of artist image which is now not so popular, or not, you know, that's not the kind of common thing, but it was at one time very much the idea of an artist. and an artist torn between beauty and pain, torn between various things. So, and the quotations are from Leonardo, as you know, Virgin of the Rocks, and from a Persian painter called Akamirak, whose painting Noshiwan, listening to the owls in the ruined palace. It's an extremely beautiful painting, and painted around the same time as Leonardo's painting. So I brought in those quotations because I wanted to paint rocks. I felt that the connection with this central figure was with some rocks and rock formations and things like that. And of course there is that dog and the severed arm, and so it's also about being animal, basically an artist animal, and being torn between being animal and wanting to be God. So that's our condition, and that's what one has to live with. Another painting with quotation is on the top is it's not a direct quotation, but it's changed. But those nude figures come from Gustav Klimt, and again the connection between violence, death, sex. It's called Grey Chamber, and guilt, of course. The idea was, for example, as I said, it's difficult to paint a painting of the rats. Similarly, I found myself drawn to looking at images of dead bodies and images of massacres, and with the net nowadays you can access a whole lot of imagery of that nature, and any nature, of course. But then one starts thinking, why is one drawn to look at such images? Of course, at one level, one is one wants to negate them in some sense, or one feels strongly about them in a negative way. But there's also this element of being attracted to looking at this kind of thing. So where does that come from? So there are various kinds of questions like that, not all answered. Okay, now I'm coming to one painting which is the most recent work that I've done, but I have some more after I do show this. This is a painting which is currently being shown at the Kochi Muralists DNA. It's called Building a Home, Exploring the World. And the idea behind it is, again, I put it in this allegorical and quotation statement because there are lots of quotations in this. It's about these twin needs in people, I mean in humans generally. The need to settle down, the need to build a home, to build a community, build a city, to be in one place, and the need to move away, to go away, to move somewhere else. And it's a biological need, and birds do it, animals do it, and for various reasons. So migration is as much a basic need as settling down is. So I have 3 details of this. So the first is about migration. It's about forced migration also. For example, this desert village from which these people have to flee because because of fighting, because of attacks from ethnic cleansing, whatever. And there is also a reference to a kind of our initial migration from Africa, the migration of the species itself. And there's a quotation of Jyoti Basu, is an artist now settled in Baroda, but from Kerala, who has painted many visionary paintings of things that look like they may be futuristic, but they also look like they may be from the mythic past. So that pillar is a kind of totemic pillar. And there's another quotation from his work in the other part of the central part. Of course, everyone knows the image of Bruegel's Star of Babel, and behind it is Tatlin's star which was proposed to be built in 1917 in post-revolutionary Russia. And both these towers are symbols of man's will to power and kind of power over nature. And they, in fact, question God's supremacy in a sense. And that's the story of the Tower of Babel. And it's interesting that the response that God has to this will of people wanting that people are now one, they have one language, and anything they can imagine, they can do. This is what the Bible says. And so, the Lord comes down and destroys their language so that they no longer understand each other. So this idea that language is so central to any community building, language is so central to being human, in fact. And the point where if God wants to stop people from being too ambitious, then what he has to do is to confuse, in fact, the word is confound their language. So I found this very interesting, and especially in this whole context of the way in which the last 100 years language has become a central issue for all philosophy and literary criticism and everything else. So, and the towers are like a little joke that they are actually placed in Fort Kochi. That's Fort Kochi that you see at the base. And the last panel, again exploration and different ideas about science itself. You know, there's quotations from Stanislaw Lem, the science fiction writer. There's quotations from Carl Sagan, and there are quotations from Thomas Kuhn. And the way in which different people look at science and what does science. Many people believe, scientists believe that science takes us step by step closer to the truth. What we know today about what the world is more accurate than what Galileo knew. That was more accurate than what Newton knew. That was more accurate than what, etc. So this kind of incremental accumulation of knowledge. And then there are others who think that this may not be quite right. So even science does not give us a clear understanding of what the relationship between knowledge, language, and the world is. So it's about issues like that. That gold disc that you see is the disc in Voyager. You know that Voyager 1 and 2 were two spacecraft sent off by NASA into deep space. Now they have passed the solar system. They're out and they will travel, keep traveling. And this fond kind of romantic idea that someday some extraterrestrial will recover and see, and then they will know that we exist or existed or whatever. So this idea of science, and it's I put it there because Carl Sagan says that science and mathematics are universal languages, that any species anywhere in the universe will understand our scientific, whatever scientific formulations. But this is questioned. Thomas Kuhn says that what the world really is like remains an open question forever. Sorry. Now, this is back to the city. The city never lets go. That's a phrase that Ranjit Hoskote, speaking about this work, used, and which I like. So that's very true. City never lets go. This is the largest painting that I did last year. It's 28 feet, it's 7 panels, 7.5 feet by 28 feet. So it's on Bombay. I'll of course show you a few. So these are the first 3 panels. It starts with Colonial Bombay, with the early buildings and what the colony, being a colony, brought to Bombay. It brought trade, It brought all the harbor development. Did bring education, it did bring religion. There's a beautiful stained glass church in Bombay, Afghan church. And then there is the second panel, which is more or less to do with, for 100 years Bombay was an industrial textile city. And now it's no longer so. So that changed. And then the growth of everyone, I mean Bombay means jhoppadpattis. So the growth of those. And there are the one panel is repeated and then two more panels. So the next three panels. The industry that still remains in the middle of these three panels. And then the newer Bombay, the malls, the constant, the middle class, which now has become so global in the sense it's traveling all the time, flying everywhere. It's quite amazing that even in my own life, 20 years back and today, the amount of air travel that one does is so much more. So all these changes and the malls and the kind of artificial sense of, in these malls, the kind of artificial sense of celebration that is kind of generated. So all this, and the last two panels, one which is a kind of IT, information technology office or a call center or whatever, and their cubicles, and the sea outside which is threatening, the eye on top which is keeping a watch, the surveillance kind of society, and again the hutments which in a sense replicate the pattern of the cubicles, so that the life, the air-conditioned space on this side and the other space on the outside are visually different and different at many levels, but at some levels they're very similar. The kind of mechanized and depressing life that they would probably. A few more details, closer details of the same, the first two upper part. This is a kind of Dharavi area with the new metros and all running through that. It's quite strange if you travel through these very kind of modern metro lines and you look down and you have all these hutments below. And the industry, going back to my old kind of preoccupation of painting the working class. And the mall. Quotations again. There's this green-faced woman with a quotation from Toulouse-Lautrec. So it's a beautiful painting in Chicago, and this idea of nightlife, of excitement, of loud music and all that in the malls. There's always something on sale, there's always, it's either Christmas or Diwali or whatever. But then this Bombay is a city won from the sea, they say. And there's always this image of the sea threateningly at the border of Bombay. There's a small figure there, if you see, in white, who's standing looking out at the sea. Again a quotation, in a way, indirectly, of a painting by David Friedrich, the German romantic, who has a painting of a figure standing on top of a mountain and looking out. So an image of man, the brave man, brave new, facing the brave new world. So here it's a question, what kind of brave new world? Another image of, now we have Trump Tower in Bombay, we will soon have Calatrava, and we have the latest architectural wonders, and but we may also push people in the hutments into even greater kind of misery. And these 5 panels. That painting, I'm showing you 5 panels because it's a 7-panel painting, but 5 panels are displayed in one space and then in the adjacent space on the same wall, but in an the next 2 panels. So, thank you. This is the last image.
Your slideshow. We really enjoyed every bit of the slideshow. It was so interesting. From what we see, you largely connect with the labor class and the middle class. And it's so nice to see that you are so observant about minute details and their mannerisms. Now, my question is referring to the past when the terrorists attacked Bombay. They attacked the guest of the Taj and the Sheraton and the Leopold restaurant.
Yes.
I'm referring to all the train passengers, the railway passengers that were caught unawares and were shot dead.
Yes.
The whole world traumatized with what was happening in Bombay. I want you to share your experience of what went on in your mind at that time about the middle class people that we also empathize with. And didn't you have that burning desire to paint on that subject when this tragedy happened? That's one question of mine.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was definitely for all people in Bombay and everywhere a shocking incident, and those 3 days were absolutely like hell on earth. And there were at a time like this, all kinds of class distinctions break down, and people who are caught during their dinner in the Taj, as well as people who are killed on VT station or in Leopold or whatever, they're the target of the same kind of evil. So one sympathizes all of this. About painting it, as I said earlier, even a question of painting the riots is always a very difficult thing, and I'd never thought that I could ever make a painting about this. The reason being that when one wants to paint a riot, it is not because one wants to speak about how wrong that is. One wants to explore the evil within oneself. There is a guilt that one feels with every evil that happens, and then one wants to explore that to be able to say something of significance, to say as a painter, to say that this is something that shouldn't happen, why has it happened, etc., etc. I mean, there are lots of other academics and lots of other people and journalists who actually go to the spot and interview people who can give you much more about this. But as an artist, it's a question of self-questioning always. So unless and until you are in that situation, it becomes false to try and speak about something like that.
Okay, my second question is, you've traveled the world and you would have definitely sat in all fancy restaurants and rubbed shoulders with the rich. Don't you find anything interesting in these characters to put down on canvas? Or you're only attracted to the labor class and middle class?
Well, I would say that I come from a middle class family, and all my early experiences are middle class. And then as I grew up and I went to Bombay and I was exposed to this class, then I became empathetic with that and wanting to understand that. And there's always a need to understand people who are less privileged than yourself. That is I think it's a universal need. Everyone wants to understand people who are less privileged. People who are more privileged, it's not as if, even if I move about, it's not as if that's the normal society that one mixes with, apart from like if there's an opening, nowadays an art opening becomes a big kind of, thing for society people to be there, but that's That's a temporary thing. That's not the world that you actually draw your inspiration from. So there's nothing that, unless I have something interesting. So when I paint a family, I think I come closest to painting people that I understand closely.
Okay.
So it's not observations that I'm making about people. You know, I'm painting my experience. So only if this becomes an experience with the upper class, becomes something significant, then will it result in paintings. You know,
Okay, thank you.
it's not a position. It's just that what you have.
And your last painting was really marvelous, the 7-panel, 30 feet painting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Where is it exhibited right
It's
now?
in a corporate office in Bombay.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Very nice questions. You want to ask? You want to ask?
No.
I think it was a great lecture, self-explanatory. That's the reason they don't have any questions to ask. Any which way, I'm standing here to deliver the vote of thanks, a customary vote of thanks. In the first place, it was a pleasure having you, sir, because in my personal capacity, you were one of my favorite artists when I was in the Goa College of Art. Besides that, I believe you being a radiologist have a better understanding of reading X-rays. I think what you have done here through your paintings are basically trying to read the X-ray of people around social life in Mumbai. You have wonderfully done that. This lecture was a great enlightening series for us, a series of paintings that you have shown. I think we are going to be richer with this experience. Thanks a lot for being here, and we don't have any words to match that, but we are deeply touched. Thanks a lot. We would also like to thank from the foundation the Directorate of Art and Culture who have been partner with us, even though I would like to thank them especially because they have been very active along with the foundation to organize this lecture series. They go all out. In fact, the director, the deputy director, the program in charge, Siddharth, Arsenio, and then Siddhi, who compares the show for us, they have been a great help, and we are thankful to them as well. Besides that, the media, who is a very important part of spreading the news, we are thankful to them. At the same time, it might sound very cliche, I think I should stop saying this, but above all, you all, the audience, without you, we cannot complete the program. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.